On the 8th of May 1945, the Second World War ended in Europe. Over 1 million people took to the streets of the UK to celebrate. They weren't just jubilant that the war was over. They also knew that the years to come would transform their lives for the better. Long before the war ended, people had started exploring how to create a more progressive society in its aftermath. Wartime hardships fostered solidarity across the country. People warmed to the idea of reform, prompting politicians and campaigners to ask how things could be improved for everyone. As far as schools were concerned, this appetite for change was satisfied mostly through the 1944 Education Act, also known as the Butler Act. The Act put in place many of the things we take for granted about schooling today, such as dividing primary from secondary and making secondary schooling free. Before the Butler Act, children in the UK only had to attend school up to the age of 14. In 1938, only 20% of children were educated beyond that, with only 1% making it to university. The desire to fix this was already strong before the war. In 1922, education reformer Richard Henry Tawney published an influential book, Secondary Education for All. 9 years later, a committee led by another reformer, William Henry Haddo, recommended the division of primary and secondary schools. But reforms were held up by a lack of funding. Governments of the day just didn't see schools as a priority. When war broke out, many assumed that education would fall even further down the agenda. This didn't deter the reformers. In June of 1941, the Government Board of Education released a memorandum titled Education After the War, commonly known as the Green Book. It collected insights from reformers like Tawney and Haddo. Just months after the Green Book was published, Winston Churchill appointed a young Conservative MP, Richard Austin Butler, Rab to his friends, as the board's new president. Until then, Butler had worked in the Foreign Office, which was pivotal to the war effort. Historians believe Churchill wasn't happy with his performance, so he shuffled him into the Board of Education, which at the time was seen as a political backwater. It would never again be seen that way after Butler's appointment. Butler quickly saw that the Green Book offered him a chance to reshape society and set about turning it into law. He wrote to Churchill asking for a joint select committee to explore new legislation. Churchill turned him down, warning, "We cannot have party politics in wartime." Undeterred, Butler went ahead with his plan to propose new legislation. He knew that one of Churchill's major concerns was that any new law governing education would rile up religious authorities. As a young MP, Churchill had witnessed a similar controversy in 1902, when powers to set up and run schools were transferred from church bodies to local government. Over the next 2 years, Butler reached out to various church authorities and gradually brokered a compromise, allowing them to stay involved in education and receive government funding while also giving local education authorities greater control. By 1943, Butler was ready to take the next step, publishing a white paper, Educational Reconstruction. It formalized many of the recommendations in the Green Book and fleshed out how the reforms would work in practice. And it formed the basis for the Butler Act, which received royal assent in 1944 and was enacted in 1945, shortly after the war. One of the Act's most famous consequences was the tripartite system of state schooling: grammar schools for the academically inclined, secondary technicals for the technically inclined, and secondary moderns for everyone else. While welcomed for its progressiveness at the time, the tripartite system would go on to become one of the most controversial aspects of UK education. But that's a story for another day. Overall, the Butler Act was revolutionary for its time. Besides making secondary education free, it recommended a gradual increase of the school leaving age, introduced a more equitable funding system for schools, and brought in a new process for setting teacher salaries. It made local education authorities responsible for school meals and milk. It opened up secondary school to more girls and more children from poorer families. And it tripled the number of children attending higher education. And it turned the Board of Education into a ministry, making Butler the UK's first Minister of Education.